of BUSSW. I am honored to be here tonight to welcome you, and we're always excited when we have one of our own wonderful alum, Dr. Greer Hamilton, to speak to us tonight. So I just came on to say welcome. I know it's going to be an enlivening and wonderful discussion. I'm going to turn it over now to tonight's moderator, Ellie Zambrano, our Executive Director of the Center for Social Work Innovation and Health.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Hello, colleagues. It's great to be here in community with you all as a member of the Equity and Inclusion Committee here at Boston University School of Social Work. Our Equity and Inclusion Committee includes all BU School of Social Work stakeholders, faculty, staff, students, administrators, and alumni. We're here today to participate and welcome everyone to our E&I Speaker Series event focused on from eugenic practices to social policing, social work, and reproductive oppression with friend and colleague, Dr. Greer Hamilton. Our committee has been around for many years, engaging in the work of building equity, justice, anti-oppressive practice here at the school, as well as amplifying social justice focused on activities in the community. Some of the work we have engaged in includes organizing social justice learning communities, creating anti-oppressive teaching, learning labs, student support, solidarity circles, and mentoring for anti-oppressive practice. We also have a wonderful resource page available to anyone. It includes podcasts, peer-reviewed literature, media articles, and I encourage everyone to check it out on our Equity and Inclusion resource page. Finally, we have a free 3-hour module on structural and institutional racism. Again, this is available to anyone in the world, and you can access it as long as you have online access. I'm going to briefly review our format for today. I will introduce Dr. Hamilton, and she will present for about 30 minutes. We'll then have 2 members of our BU School of Social Work community offer a 1-minute reflection about the talk and ask Dr. Hamilton a question. Finally, we'll be able to answer a few questions from our audience that you can type directly into the chat. But before we begin, I'd like to review a few Zoom housekeeping items. First, anyone who's receiving CEUs will need to keep their camera on for the duration of the entire session. If you're not receiving CEUs, we recommend turning it off during the presentation. If you're receiving CEUs, you'll need to complete the evaluation form. We'll type the link to the form in the chat at the end of the presentation. We cannot send you the evaluation form. The link to the form will be posted in the chat at the end of the entire presentation. Once you complete that form, it'll take about 2 weeks for you to get your CEU certificate. We suggest having your Zoom setting on speaker's view. We'll be recording the presentation, so if you aren't comfortable being recorded and you are not receiving CEUs, you can turn your camera off during the speaker presentation. We'll be posting the recording on our E&I Speaker Series page a few days after tonight's talk. All of our participants will be muted during the presentation. Please do not use the chat during Dr. Hamilton's presentation, as that can be distracting for the speaker. Closed captioning is available for this event. You can use closed captioning through Zoom. If you're joining by a computer, click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you click on live transcript, please then click Enable to start the closed captioning. If you're joining by a phone, you'll need to go to Settings, go to Meeting, and go to Closed Captioning. Finally, it goes without saying that all the comments in the chat should be respectful and mindful for our entire BU School of Social Work community. We would like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement reminds us all that colonization is an enduring reality and that Boston University sits on the stolen traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. If you're outside of Boston, take some time to learn about the tribal lands where you live and the ongoing movements to have this land honored, acknowledged, and returned. These past 3 years have been challenging in so many ways, with COVID-19 unmasking and devastating long-term effects of racial capitalism and the ongoing consequences of classism, heterosexism, and gender oppression. The timing of Dr. Hamilton's talk couldn't be more appropriate for our historical moment, where we as social workers, part of our world community, stand at a crossroad. Although Black, Indigenous, disabled, and other marginalized activists have stated for years that Roe v. Wade was not enough to protect people's reproductive rights, it wasn't until 2022 Dobbs' decision that brought our attention to reproductive rights and calls for reproductive resurfaced in the mainstream dialogue. Since then, many social work institutions and practitioners have urged those in the field to consider reproductive justice a crucial component of their social justice mission. However, they often overlook the profession's historic ties to eugenic practice and the continued policing of people's bodies.
Mhm.
That will focus on how social workers have contributed to reproductive oppression and identify opportunities for them to incorporate reproductive justice into their practice and personal lives. Our speaker tonight, friend, colleague, Dr. Greer Hamilton, is a transitional postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. Her work focuses on examining how systems of oppression are embedded and built into the environment and subsequently impact people's health, well-being, and use of public spaces. She began her research career as a research assistant for Dr. Gretchen Ellie, who studied how far people had to travel for an abortion prior to the overturning of Roe. Greer is a board member at Midwest Access Coalition and formerly the co-chair of Eastern Massachusetts Abortion Fund. Please join me in welcoming our friend and colleague in the struggle for reproductive justice, Dr. Greer Hamilton.
Hi, everyone. It is so lovely to be back here at BU. Um, Even though it's only been like 6 months or something like that. I only recently graduated, so it is nice to like quickly return back to BU. And so I'm excited to get into our conversation tonight. Um, so for this evening, this is what we'll be speaking about. I want to go over a couple of key concepts and terms that I think are essential for me, at least, in thinking about eugenics and social work's involvement. We'll talk about scientific racism and eugenics a little bit more broadly. We'll talk about, in the United States context, where social work and eugenics have overlapped. And then we'll end today by talking briefly about reproductive oppression today. So some key concepts, right? This is not an exhaustive list, so we don't have the time for that tonight. But one term that I think we use often and has a lot of different definitions is reproductive justice. When I think about reproductive justice within the context of tonight, I am grounding my understanding of RJ and Sister Song's definition. And they state that reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And activists from Sister Song to other RJ activists advocate for reproductive justice through this framework, but also through reproductive justice being an embodied practice. And what that means is just thinking about how our own like behaviors and thoughts, right, are deeply tied, right, with our liberatory futures, right? So how are we showing up in spaces so that we are able to actually allow for the maintenance of personal bodily autonomy, supporting people who have children or don't have children, and our contributions to the creation of safe and sustainable communities. Also, though, in order for us to think about these liberatory futures, we also have to attend to the fact that oppression actively exists. And reproductive oppression refers to the control and exploitation of individuals through their bodies, sexuality, labor, and reproduction. I also think it's important for us to remember that oppression doesn't just happen, right? So Ellie went through, right, talking about colonization through the land acknowledgement, but also through some of the recent events where we've seen oppression play out. And so I want to just briefly offer a definition for white supremacy as one way that we can understand kind of how oppression manifests. So white supremacy is, or how I'm understanding it to be, is a socio-political structure that relies on the control and power of material resources, the maintenance of ideas, both conscious and unconscious, of white superiority, the subjugation of non-white people through political, economic, and cultural systems. And I think when we talk about eugenics, you'll be able to actively see that play out. And the last definition I just want to introduce, because again, it is tied to these conversations about bodily autonomy, is structural racism. And also, this was already mentioned, our anti-racism course. We don't have the space tonight to talk about structural racism, in detail. But again, as we're talking about bodily autonomy and within the United States context, even recent events like the Dobbs decision and the upcoming Supreme Court decision around abortion pills, right, are tied to issues of structural racism, right, which refers to the ways that social, political, economic, or cultural institutions interact to produce racial discrimination and inequality, as well as the understandings and meanings we give categories of race. So if you're interested in learning more about whether it's white supremacy or structural racism, would encourage you to take the 3-hour course that was mentioned. Now, before getting into talking about social workers' involvement with the eugenics movement, I think it's important for us to remember that the eugenics movement in the United States of the 19th and 20th centuries are related to longstanding efforts to justify and explain biological differences between races. Scientific racism predates the eugenics movement and was an effort by politicians and medical professionals to use scientific methods to objectively prove that there were biological differences between people of different races, which would hopefully, right, for them prove white biological superiority. Ultimately, though, these tactics co-opted science as an objective knowledge that was used to justify racial inequality. Notable scholars and leaders in the United States have expressed support of scientific racism throughout their work. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson wrote in his book Notes on the State of Virginia that biological differences between Black and white people were evident through Black people's childlike fearlessness and naivety, Black women's hypersexuality, as well as their complexion, right? He identified as a lay scientist and tried to establish these claims, right, for scientific racism in his work. We also see scientific racism kind of furthered and like reified through the work of Samuel Morton. So in the 19th century, medical journals became important tools for disseminating findings of scientific racism and medicine kind of more broadly. Medical professionals like Samuel George Morton helped to strengthen claims of scientific racism through his research on human skulls in the 1830s and 1840s. During these 10 years, Morton collected the skulls of deceased people in order to assess whether brain skull size was related to racial differences. Morton's most famous study was a study of the skulls of 6 racial categories: white people, Asian, Mongolian, Malay, Native American, and Black people. And Morton would measure the interior capacity of the skulls and relate the capacity of it to traits or attributes like disposition or intelligence. Morton came to the conclusion through his research that white people were biologically superior because their skull measurements suggested that they had the cranial facilities to attain the highest intellectual endowments. Whereas Morton stated that the Native American people were averse to cultivation and slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war, and wholly destitute of maritime adventure. He also referred to the Ethiopian or Negro people as being joyous, flexible, and indolent, and also referred to them as being from nations which compose this race present as a singular diversity of intellectual character, of which the far extreme is the lowest grade of humanity, right? So Morton, a medical professional, right, was using research, right, to again, to like substantiate like these claims that there were these racial differences that should then allow for different treatments between, at least in this study, right, these 6 different racial categories. We also see, right, scientific racism kind of made visible or evident through gynecologist work like James Marion Sims. So James Marion Sims was a gynecologist here in the United States, mainly in the South, who's credited with the development of a surgical technique that was able to treat chronic complications of childbirth. He also is credited as the inventor of the vaginal speculum. Sims conducted groundbreaking experiments on at least 7 enslaved Black women, One that was obviously done without their consent, as they were treated as property, right? So consent was gathered from the slave owners. He also conducted these experiments without pain management. Partly, right, there is belief that there just was not necessarily the pain management treatment available, but also there was this quote unquote scientific belief that Black people were less sensitive to pain, right? And so all of these experiments would not actually be painful to them, right? And so at least what we know is seven enslaved Black women endured these experiments, with one having over 30 operations in total. I offer these examples because I think it's important to understand that the eugenics movement, again, of the 19th and 20th century, which we'll be talking about, is informed by this 100-plus-year effort, right, to use scientific methods to justify the inhumane treatment of people on the basis of their race. Additionally, I also mention these examples because these were led by notable scholars, medical professionals, and politicians of the time. So these were not fringe beliefs, right? These were things that were commonplace, right? And part of kind of our knowledge dissemination. Now, in 1883, Francis Galton, who is the cousin of Darwin, proposed the term eugenics. He proposed the term eugenics to explore, well, during his studies, to explore if success, abilities, and aptitude were genetic. Galton developed a system that cataloged human traits and characteristics in order to study the genetic transmission of physical, behavioral, and performative qualities. His ultimate purpose was to create a science that allowed for the most genetically superior people to eventually outnumber those who possessed what he deemed as inferior traits, which could be based off of race, class, or abilities. And he thought about the breeding, right, of these breeding out of these inferior traits through this concept of, right, better breeding. Galton's work eventually found its way to the United States, where eugenicists who were often progressive era thinkers, such as academics, scientists, economists, and other social reformers, sought to use Galton's techniques to develop a master white and Nordic race at this time through the elimination of those who were considered unfit. First, through the development of xenophobic policies to curb the influx of non-Nordic immigrants to the United States in the early 1900s, but also through the use of science to justify selective reproduction. It is important to remember, as we talk about the US eugenicist goals in the early 1900s, that the concept of race is not a fixed one. It's still not a fixed one, right? So to progressive era thinkers, race often referred to ethnicity or nationality, and they often distinguish race by varieties and qualities of whiteness. So, right, as an example, right, Italian people at this time, right, were not perceived to be white, right? And again, this was based off of the Nordic standard around varieties and qualities of whiteness. Like with scientific racism, the eugenic movement was embraced by politicians and economists. Eugenic thought was contained within federal and state laws and had an impact on thousands of lives. On the federal level, we see it in immigration policies like the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which is otherwise known as the Immigration Act of 1924, which imposed immigration quotas on the number of immigrants granted access to the United States. We can also see it in the development of economic concepts like breeding out, which was developed by economist and eugenicist Irving Fisher. Fisher served as a consultant to the Eugenics Record Office, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and vocally supported the idea of eliminating the offspring of the lower classes in an effort to reduce the fiscal impact of welfare. The eugenics movement that Galton and supporters in the United States followed is referred to as negative eugenics, which is the discouraging of reproduction by persons having perceived genetic defects or presumed to have inheritable and undesirable traits. So to me, one important lesson from this time is around the use of the law to repress bodily autonomy for marginalized people. I'm not sure how many people know about Buck versus Bell, which is a 1927 Supreme Court case, but if you're not familiar, we're going to walk through it tonight, because I think it ties, again, back to recent Supreme Court cases. But the 1927 law provided some legal context for the reach of our government to control people's bodies and access to reproductive health services. So for some additional context for how Buck versus Bell came to be in 1927, in 1910, states began to introduce state laws that would allow for eugenical or forced sterilization, with Indiana being the first state to introduce such a law. These laws allowed for the use of forced sterilization to be used on unfit people to prevent them from having children, which would again be considered a burden on the nation. Following Indiana's state law, in 1924, Virginia enacted a state law that allowed for the sterilization of people institutionalized in what they called colonies, which were for people who had mental illness, epilepsy, any type of disability, or were deemed morally delinquent, right? And morally delinquent at this time could have been anything from being low income to having had sex outside of marriage to being gay, right? The moral delinquency was a really broad kind of concept. In the fall of 1924, Carrie Buck, who at the time was roughly about 18 years old, was institutionalized at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded for moral delinquency. This is at the same institution where her mother, Emma Buck, who's pictured here in this photo, was also institutionalized because she had been deemed morally delinquent for suspected promiscuity. Carrie, just so for additional context, came to the institution herself as a survivor of rape, and she had become pregnant as a result of it, and so she had given birth to her daughter, Vivian. And as a result of the rape and the pregnancy, had been institutionalized at this colony. Eugenicists at the time were looking for a legal case to set precedent for the use of forced sterilization of morally delinquent or unfit people, and those in particular who came from familial lines that were perceived as unfit, right? The Buck family, right? Her mother being deemed morally delinquent, herself being morally delinquent, and by virtue, her daughter would have been deemed morally delinquent. I think it's also important to note that not only was the Buck family perceived unfit because of these moral delinquencies, but their status as low-income Southern people also contributed to their perception of being unfit. In the Buck versus Bell case, Harry Laughlin, a sociologist and respected forced sterilization advocate, provided statements to early court cases regarding Harry Buck that claimed that the Buck family would continue to reproduce morally delinquent children. And not only did Harry Laughlin provide commentary to the cases, Carrie Buck also had a court-appointed lawyer who was in favor of sterilization and did not effectively offer her fair representation. In May 1927, the Supreme Court of the United States sided with John Hendren Bell, who was the then superintendent of the state colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, where Carrie was institutionalized. The Supreme Court sided with Bell, claiming that the federal government had the right to suppress her bodily autonomy and the autonomy of others who were disabled and residents of the colonies, essentially for the greater good. In the dissent, the then Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is revered as like a major legal scholar at this time, stated, "It is better for all of the world, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Right, so we see, right, that not only are these eugenic thoughts playing out, right, in both federal and state policies, but also legal scholars at this time saw it as a tool, right, for the improvement of our country. So history on the eugenics movement and social work has found that social workers actually played some pivotal roles in the eugenics movement of the 19th and 20th century. And it's important to keep in mind that at the same time as the eugenics movement is spreading in the United States, there's also increased attention on social reform and the crafting of social work professional identities. A lot of people reference Abraham Flexner's talk, "Is Social Work a Profession?" From 1915 as being a part of this questioning about if at all social work is a profession in the ways that medicine and engineering were to Flexner at this time. Now, in the years following Flexner's critique of social work, we would see people we revere as kind of foremothers like Mary Richmond publish her work on social work case methods, and settlement house workers like Jane Addams here on my left, using scientific methods to assess the needs of people receiving services at the settlement houses. Richmond and Addams are not only notable for their work in crafting some of the earliest examples of contemporary US social work identity, but they actively believed and advocated for eugenics. Mary Richmond used scientific methods to discuss issues of morality and degenerate families. Richmond even championed particular forms of care based off the fitness of a child and their family. In the case of immigrant children, Richmond would use base her decision on if a person should be deported around if they were considered to be unfit to stay in the country. Similarly, Jane Addams embraced eugenic ideas and interventions in her work. As I mentioned in Hull House, Addams and other social reformers would use scientific evaluation within juvenile courts had been established to investigate families. And as vice president of the American Social Hygiene Association, which focused on the use of eugenic ideas to improve the social hygiene of the country, Addams consulted on plans that would lead to the confinement of women in order to prevent them from having children. Some historians suggest that social workers like Addams and Richmond embraced the pseudoscience of eugenics to assist with the forming, right, of this credible professional identity that was rooted in hard science, right, which again, going back to Flexner, was something that he seemed to question. While this is possible, I think we also cannot forget the role of religion and class in shaping early social reformers' beliefs about social problems. It is likely a combination of Richmond's and Adams' own religious upbringings and class standings, as well as these efforts, right, to professionalize, that actually led them to believe and support eugenicist thoughts around degeneracy, right, residing in the human body. Social workers at the time not only engaged in eugenicist thinking within settlement houses or court systems, but they also held roles within the Eugenics Records Office at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is located on Long Island, New York. Actually, where I'm from, as a child, we went to visit the laboratory, this is an aside, but as a child, we went to visit the laboratory, and there was no discussion, right, of this history, but, right, is a place that, I lived very nearby. The Eugenics Records Office was established in 1910 and is often actually lauded as the center of the American eugenics movement. The ERO expressly advocated for the compulsory sterilization of the unfit, and they maintained a data repository for trait pedigree records. Now, beginning in 1912, the Eugenics Record Office began offering a 6-week summer course at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, led by biologist Charles Davenport and sociologist Harry Laughlin, who I mentioned for the Buck versus Bell case that would follow this, the creation of the summer program. The purpose of the summer course in eugenics was to train students in completing pedigree or hereditary studies according to the discipline of eugenics. Most social workers working for the Eugenics Record Office held professional titles such as eugenic field workers, and these field workers were often appointed to various institutions and social welfare agencies across the country to conduct what were known as family studies of those who were considered insane or degenerate. Family studies entailed the task of cataloging those who were institutionalized or those who were interfacing with social welfare agencies, as well as their offspring and their extended family, or anyone who displayed signs of genetic inferiority, which again, right, at this time could have included things as simple as poverty, or not as simple, but right, poverty. An example of social workers' involvement with the Eugenics Record Office is the work of social worker Harriet Abbott in Vermont. So Harriet Abbott was a social worker and Eugenics Record Office trained field worker who conducted family studies in Vermont. Abbott was a graduate of the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, which is the current school known as Crown School of Social Work, who previously had worked as a former settlement house and child welfare worker. During her time in Vermont, Abbott completed pedigree studies of 6,000 Vermonters, both living and deceased. Between 1927 and 1928, Abbott and others worked to create a central file of Vermont's allegedly unfit families whose members had found themselves either as dependents of the state or whose children had been classified as neglected. All of this information was gathered for the purpose of compiling the Eugenics Survey of Vermont, which is the map on my left of my screen. Social workers and those involved in charity work in Vermont were encouraged to consult the pedigree files that had been assembled by the field workers to inform their work with children and families. Abbott, like Adams and Richmond, aggressively conflated social ills like poverty with attributes which were often labeled as defects. Abbott and other social workers consulted with the Eugenic Record Office's literature and cataloged defects according to the ideals laid out by eugenicists. Abbott's work helped to add to a previously established eugenic thought that individuals and families that were unfit were burdens to taxpayers, and it was the role of social workers and charity organizations to remedy the cost of those perceived social ills. The findings of the Vermont Eugenic Survey were published in the annual reports and were subsequently distributed to philanthropists and politicians. Henry Perkins, the director of the Eugenic Survey of Vermont, stated in 1927 that the rights of the individual cannot be fully safeguarded when he is being compelled to support in the midst of his community the lawless, the immoral, the degenerate, and the mentally defective. We are beginning to know enough about human heredity, about the working of the sterilization laws to have a little courage and to undertake a much needed reform, to make our state safe for decent citizens, to free the taxpayer from unnecessary burden and the support of the heredity defective, to place upon a self-respecting, self-supporting basis the largest percentage of our boys and girls. These are the objects for which constructive social betterment measures ought to be passed. Now, the social betterment measurements that he was talking about was for sterilization laws at the state level. So the Eugenic Survey of Vermont would be used to actually help establish a 1931 forced sterilization law in Vermont. It's also important to remember that while we're talking about Vermont and like the New England Northeast area at this moment, that again, these field workers were sent across the country. And regardless of where they were located, they were still tasked with this conducting of family studies on the degenerate and the unfit, like the ones that were done in Vermont. Often, again, the primary affliction of those that they were studying were those who were living in poverty, those who had disabilities, or those who were behaving in behaviors, right, that were deemed inappropriate at the time. Now, before talking about the last example of social workers' involvement in the eugenics movement, I want to show you how pervasive eugenical or forced sterilization was. So this first map shows sterilization legislation in 1914 or 1913, actually. This was made by Harry Laughlin, who was again associated with the Eugenics Record Office. So this is 1914 or 1913, 3 years after the first state law had been introduced in Indiana in 1910. This second map shows the map of pending and laws in effect for eugenical sterilization in 1935. This was 8 years after the Buck versus Bell case. You can see that the black lines that are going across are states that had eugenical sterilization laws in effect at this time, and the states that are painted black are ones that had pending laws. So most of the country, right, had either a eugenical sterilization law in place or in progress. Now, while Abbott provides an example of the ways that social workers' involvement and leadership in the eugenic movement contributed to state-level forced sterilization laws, as well as the engagement practices that focus on provision of services based off of the ideas of fitness, another example I want to provide is social workers' involvement with the Eugenics Board of North Carolina. North Carolina was unique because under their 1933 state law on forced sterilizations, social workers were explicitly given the power to petition the Eugenics Board of North Carolina, meaning they were given the authority by the state to make suggestions as to who should be sterilized. The archival documents and research on social workers' involvement in forced sterilization in North Carolina suggests that social workers in the state often advocated for the forced sterilization of childbearing age women who were receiving social welfare programs because they believed that they posed a potential burden on society. It's important to note that while the Black population of North Carolina accounted for approximately 23% of the state population in the mid to late 1900s, Black people made up 39% of the total sterilized population from 1929 to 1968. It made up over 60% of the total sterilized population in the state from 1958 through 1968. The Eugenics Board of North Carolina would be active between 1929 and 1977. It is suggested that at minimum 7,000 people were forcibly sterilized during this period of time. And 85% of those who were, or they claim that 85% of those sterilized identified as women and 15% identified as men, with an overwhelming percentage of all people being sterilized having the basis of either a mental illness or a disability. According to the records, North Carolina was one of the top 3 states for forced sterilization. And it's also important to note that in recent events, right, North Carolina has tried to make some repairs for this harm done. in 2010, North Carolina would establish the Justice for Sterilization Victims Fund, which would seek to compensate victims who were forcibly sterilized by the state of North Carolina's Eugenics Board. So the engagement of social workers like Mary Richmond, Jane Addams, Harriet Abbott, and the countless other social workers in North Carolina in the eugenics movement was deeply informed by a combination of things. But what we know is that in particular their class, racial, religious values, as well as this pursuit of a professional identity, helped to create this ample kind of moment where we could conflate moral ills with social problems. We also can't forget that there were also ongoing discourses about race being rooted in biology that are happening at the same time as eugenics thought is becoming more popular in the United States, and that there was increasing socio-political processes trying to remedy the increase of non-white populations through the use of birth control, propaganda about overpopulation, as well as the introduction of other economic policies both internationally and in the United States. Now, after World War II, the eugenic movement in the United States would begin to dissipate, but the categorization of who is seen as deserving of reproductive autonomy still actively exists. There are still states that actually still have the 20th century eugenic laws still in the books, and many more states have altered the language to still allow for cases of forced sterilization. While historically laws that followed Buck versus Bell in 1927 were focused on the prevention of birth by people who were deemed as unfit, today states often use the concept of forced sterilization to suggest it as a helpful tool that can similarly provide support for the greater good, but they introduce it through this idea of birth control and options that can be used to kind of curb certain populations, in particular those who are incarcerated, immigrants, and people with disabilities. The National Women's Law Center has found that many states have forced sterilization laws that allow for the sterilization of adults and children with disabilities. In some states, not only can a family member or doctor request the state to sterilize this disabled child or adult, but a social worker can actively do that. Additionally, since 2020, immigrant people have reported that Immigration and Customs Service, or ICE, detainees have been coerced into having hysterectomies or other gynecological procedures that are not clearly explained to them. Another present-day example of the ways that social workers have become the agents of the state and have supported the repression of bodily autonomy is also through the criminalization of self-managed abortions. In recent years, there has been an increase in legislation that criminalizes people for abortions. In 2023, a study conducted by If, When, How, which is a reproductive rights-related organization, did a study on abortion criminalization. Of those that they studied, they found that 6% of abortion-related legal cases were initiated by social workers. And while care providers, including social workers, medical professionals, and others, may be mandated by state law to report certain health or domestic matters, as mandatory reporters, there actually is not a state or a federal law that requires the suspected or actual occurrence of a self-managed abortion in particular, to be reported to the law. And so this finding and the existing but limited research on why providers, including social workers, engage law enforcement has often found that most of this, is a result of either biases, whether it's racial, class, or other types of biases a person might have to the person they're interacting with, but also as a result of abortion stigma. And abortion stigma being pretty broad, either the lack of understanding of what a self-managed abortion is, the medications that are involved with it, but also, again, abortion kind of more broadly, even outside of self-managed abortion. And as we begin to close, I just wanted to say that the past and present ways that reproductive oppression has occurred has been supported by and endorsed by social workers. And we as a profession, like others, are deeply rooted in oppression. And we often have this implicit, kind of not implicit, but unstated, desire, to repress certain bodies, in order to allow for other types of experiences or power to be demonstrated or made visible. And it's not surprising that of those 70,000 people forcibly sterilized in the 20th century, and the many more who continue to be today, that many of those have been Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, people who are low income, people with lower levels of literacy, immigrants and non-English speakers, people with disabilities, and people who are incarcerated. Our language and our tactics may have changed, but we as a profession still contribute to practices that repress and criminalize bodily autonomy. Now, this is an image created by interrupting criminalization, and it visualizes the ways that reproduction can be criminalized, right? It goes through things like social services to the court systems, right? And as a profession, we are deeply embedded in all of these systems that are named here. And so as a result of that, we as a profession, not necessarily individual, but as a profession, right, are involved in passive and explicit ways within all of these points of reproductive criminalization. And through our efforts to professionalize, we have found ourselves in these spaces that allows us to wield titles and powers and power that has the ability to inform access to care and services. So tonight, really kind of why I'm kind of thinking about this is, right, I think we often have an uneven understanding of our social work history. And so as we think about reproductive justice, again, in the context of abortion access over the past year, I think it's a question for us about how, as a profession, are we going to show up and think about reproductive justice. We have to consider individually and as a profession, how are we going to develop an embodied practice that is rooted in reproductive justice in order to challenge the repression of bodily autonomy that happens every day through trans legislation, abortion bans, and international policy. Right, we can see this in the ways that we are moving forward with abortion access in the United States. But we want to be able to think about, as a profession, what are the things that we need to do in order to ensure that there is bodily autonomy. This list is not exhaustive, and I'm happy to talk more about it, but right, I think there's ways that we can begin to critically examine and even challenge certain professional standards, right, that allows us to continue to perpetuate repressive tendencies. As the if, when, how research has shows, there's an increasing need for us to focus on destigmatizing abortion, but also, right, reproductive justice is not just an abortion issue, right? There are other sexual and reproductive health matters that we need to be thinking about. How do we make sure that materials are available? How are we using supportive and inclusive language in our work? How do we visibly, right, show that we are supporting it? Engaging in movement spaces, advocating for policy changes, as well as, again, this idea of embodying. So building community with people, creating alternative structures that provide support and safety, and also supporting people where they are, which is something that as a profession we claim, but right, is something that we can actually live into when it comes to bodily autonomy. And so I will end there. Thank you all so much, and I'm excited to talk with you for a bit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton, for your powerful, informative, and resourceful presentation. I'd like to introduce our first reflector, Amy Washington. Amy is a first-year student at Boston University, pursuing dual degrees in social work and education. Prior to her arrival at BU, she worked as a high school Spanish teacher and in undergraduate admissions. She's deeply passionate about both social work and education and hopes to pursue a career at the intersection of these fields in the future. Amanda?
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton, for that amazing presentation. I think I was particularly struck and appreciated how you tied social work so heavily to kind of influence and engagement with the eugenics movement, both many, many decades ago and even now. And I'm definitely looking forward to continuing to doing more research now that you've kind of open my eyes to this dark history, and also hoping to continue to educate my peers and question this as well. One question that I have for you is just thinking about how we now as social workers can interrupt kind of thoughts and approaches and actions that result in our work, particularly with people and families that may tie back to the eugenics movement. And how can we support our agencies in pushing back against this as well? And thinking particularly in states where you may be going against the law, your job may be on the line, right? So there are extremely high stakes for potentially going against kind of policies and practices, but at the same time, there are really awful and negative high stakes for going in line with them as well that can be directly harmful to communities that we work with. So just hoping to hear your thoughts a little bit on how we can kind of push back and some steps we can take to interrupt these processes, both in ourselves and kind of with those that we work with. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think for like the personal level, I think some of it is just continuing to educate yourself, right? Like I grew up in a really religious family, for example, where abortion was not something that you talked about, right? And so like it wasn't like later, it was later in my life where I began to even really think about, right, what abortion actually was, right? And it as even a reproductive just health service, right? So I think it's for one, a first step is like I think continuing to do the education yourself to understand kind of what are ideas that you have about some of these topics and where are they coming from, right? Where did you learn them and how can you kind of deconstruct that? I think another thing I think is creating kind of community spaces where you can have those conversations, right? I don't know if you have to do it just alone. I think there are either whether it's abortion funds or Planned Parenthood groups, right? There are spaces where you can become engaged and continue to either learn and or translate that to action, because I think that ties with part of your second point is around we may be in organizations or even states where they are hostile towards reproductive health or justice or rights kind of more broadly, but that doesn't mean that there actually aren't groups of people who are doing the work, right, to try to shift those policies, right? I think about colleagues of mine who are in Kansas, right, which I think we would consider to be not as kind of progressive as Massachusetts, for example, right? But there are groups of people who are doing direct action, right? Who are actually challenging state laws and trying to ensure that reproductive rights, right, are enshrined, right, in state legislation. So I think even if it is, we're in a more hostile space, it doesn't mean that we don't still do the thing, right, around finding spaces to do action and advocacy. And I think it's just a matter of doing it differently. So one thing that I will plug, and I can send it to like Dawn, we're doing a digital security training for social workers on Monday, right? Because some of what you might do in terms of thinking about how you organize just needs to be done in settings or spaces that are not, using your work computer or using the, your normal text app, right? Maybe there are just other kind of opportunities for you to engage in those conversations or activities that we're just not thinking about right now because we haven't, as a profession, had to do that. I don't know if that answers any of your questions, and I'm happy to continue to engage with you around that afterward.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you for your question. Next is our second reflector, Dr. Jennifer M. Gomez is an assistant professor in the clinical practice department at the School of Social Work and faculty affiliate at the Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health at BU, as well as a board member and chair of the Research Advisory Committee at the Center for Institutional Courage. Her research centers around cultural betrayal trauma theory, which she created to examine the impact of violence on Black and other marginalized youth, young adults, and elders within the context of inequity. Her book, The Cultural Betrayal of Black Women and Girls, A Black Feminist Approach to Healing from Sexual Abuse, centers Black women and girls to understand sexual abuse and healing while identifying strategies for transforming the world into a more peaceful and equitable place. Jennifer?
Thank you so much, Ellie. And thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. This was absolutely brilliant. The thought that kept coming into my head during your talk was like history is present, and it helped me to kind of deal with a dialectic I kind of perpetually hold in the field of social work of, on the one hand, this ethical imperative to identify and dismantle systems of oppression and, center marginalized people, and that all sounds wonderful, with the history of social work in the US being founded in the US. So with all of the white supremacy, scientific racism, eugenics that you discussed, as well as founders Jane Addams and others being part of this, and kind of how we then see this kind of like historical legacy of white supremacy and eugenics within our present in social work, and how being able to have history and present not be so far apart, but actually be kind of like one and the same in how we think about our roles in social work. My question, or what I'm hoping, I'm just love to hear your thoughts about, is about social workers' role, especially in the link between mental health and reproductive oppression. And so my question is around how can social workers advocate for mental health services for folks, for instance, in ways that don't follow into this kind of Buck versus Bell, Jane Addams, et cetera, discriminatory and paternalistic view of making decisions on reproduction based on someone being deemed as mentally ill or mentally unwell, and how those determinations of being mentally unwell is interlaced with intersectional oppression of sexism, racism, classism, ableism. So the question really of how can social workers be sensitive and be advocates for mental health and mental health services without going along the same continuum that removes people's rights away and related to reproduction and reproductive justice in particular. Thanks, Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you. I will note that I'm not a trained clinician, so just for some additional kind of context, I think as I offer this response, I think one thing that like we can do that I think we can sometimes do well in community work, right, is kind of shifting who is seen as like the expert, right, of kind of their experience, right, and so I think to me, one of the first steps, right, is kind of, and I think has been done by like disability justice advocates for the past, 20 so years, right, is really kind of flipping on its head, right, the idea of who is an expert around certain identities, right, and centering those voices in the conversation. So I think while we're talking about mental health and disability, right, we should be making sure that as we're creating new policies, practices, even advancing language, right? Because every couple of years, right, we learn to do a new word or new way of framing something that people who have mental illness or disabilities are a part of that conversation and shaping those new ways of like how, as a profession, we're going to engage with them. Because I think if we fail to do that, we continue to then fall into this trap of us as social workers, right, the professional role, deciding for folks what they ought to be doing, what they will be doing, right, instead of recognizing that, right, even a kind of across the spectrum of ability, right, people are deserving of autonomy. Does the autonomy look different? Potentially so, yes, but that doesn't mean that you don't still grant someone the opportunity to be engaged in, right, decision making about their bodies. You just have to, right, meet them kind of where they are in terms of their ability to do that. And so I think for me, I think in answering this question, I guess I would just encourage that social workers, one, deepen their understanding of disability. Even if you are in that space, I don't think that precludes us from like spending more time thinking about new ways that people are talking about disability and mental illness, right? In particular from groups like disability justice advocates, and then to create or to so we don't always have to create stuff, right? I think that's also like a bad thing. We don't have to be the creators, but to find those spaces where we can challenge, right, the language or the tools that we're using, so we can find new and better ones to support bodily autonomy.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your question. And we're going to move over to audience questions. And we'd like to encourage everyone to please type your questions into the chat. And we'll do our best as much as time allows to, go over at least 2 or 3 questions. So the first question that we have for Greer, for Dr. Hamilton, what's been the outcome of the eugenics laws that were shown on the map? When did they end or change?
So it's going to be state dependent. So right, like I mentioned, in North Carolina, the law that started in 1929 ended in 1977, for example. But right, there was actually more recent things where, like in California, I think it was I could be getting my numbers wrong, but in like 2020, up until 2010, for example, right, forced sterilization was allowed in like state prisons in California. Right. So I would say that like there's just a variance on whether it's either state or some of the other institutional players, right, who were also perpetuating it. So as recent, right, as 11 years ago.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Okay, a second question. Is there a topic that you'd like to expand upon from your presentation or any current events?
Okay. Colleagues and I are, so there actually is a good amount of articles written like, so good, maybe like 10 to 20 articles written about this topic. So there is some existing research already done on this history, but some colleagues and I are going to continue to write about social workers history with reproductive health. So I think that would be one. Two, I don't know if I could find it fast enough, but I can try to find it before this call ends. Like I mentioned, we're hosting we as like the group of social workers are hosting a digital security training on Monday, December 18th at 7:30 p.m. So right in the wake of the genocide that's happening in Palestine, and we want to give social workers the tools to think about how to securely engage in activism. And so how do we compartmentalize our work and also think about digital security? But I will share that with organizers so they can email it to you all. Otherwise, you can email me, whoever asked me this question, and I'm happy to give you more events if you want them.
And our last question is, are you aware of social workers who were resisting these actions of the profession in eugenics movement?
Yeah, I think it, so if we rethink about that image I showed from interrupting criminalization, about reproductive criminalization, I think there are social workers across that spectrum, right? Because again, eugenics didn't just affect, right, disabled people or mentally ill people, right? So I think across the spectrum, there are social workers who are actively resisting it. I think, right, we know there are social workers actively who are engaged in advocacy and research around the trans legislation that is ongoing, right? We can think about some of that work as being a descendant, right, of eugenic thinking, right, around who is deemed as fit, worthy of autonomy, all of that. And so, yes, I would say that we actively are seeing that. So again, if you have questions or are looking for groups, I'm happy to point you in the direction if you email me.
Dr. Hamilton, we want to thank everyone for attending, our wonderful speaker, Dr. Greer Hamilton, our insightful reflectors, Amanda Washington, Dr. Jennifer Gomez, and finally, our amazing behind-the-scenes research assistants and the tech support for all of our equity and inclusion events, Megan, Niza, and Julia D'Angelo. One more reminder that if you're getting CEUs, you must complete the form using the link that Julia has just put in the chat. And it'll take up to 2 weeks for you to receive your certificate. In the movement, we like to say that the path to justice is more like a marathon, not a sprint. Please take good care of yourselves, everyone, because we all need you to create our new world. We hope to see you at our next Equity and Inclusion speaker event on Thursday, January 25th, 2024, when Dr. Julian Agaman, professor at Tufts University, will be speaking about just sustainability in policy, planning, and practice. We hope you have a peaceful break. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you, everyone.